Morning. There we go. Morning, excuse me. This could be painful. Good morning, everybody. Good to see you. Somehow, possibly due to the 5 tennis tournaments I had last week, my voice is all of a sudden gone jankety. So this could be very, very short, or you could do all the talking. So one of those things is going to be, a couple of those things may be in play right here. I appreciated Richard's lessons last week on the reset, and I love the idea that for a while anyway, we're doing, in essence, kind of standalone lessons, because it gives you an opportunity to talk about something that maybe has been resting in your head or you've heard about and you thought that might not be a series, but that's something that really I think is probably a decent thing to talk about one time. And I read an article a couple weeks ago, and I didn't start out to read this article for this particular purpose, but it dovetailed into a description about Joseph and the life that he led and the way that he kept his attitude kind of about life as positive as he possibly could. Really, what I'd been looking at was verses to kind of lead into a call to worship about having the kind of hearts that are gracious and graceful and forgiving and loving and encouraging. And I stumbled upon this article, and it really struck me of what kind of example that he had been. We live in a really, I think, contentious time right now. We've probably, oh, you're the very best. In your hands. Thank you. Oh, that's good. The world may have always been contentious. I mean, it may have always been a place where people are at each other's throats and yipping at each other and whatever it might be. But it seems to me like this last 8 months has been way worse. There's a song about 15 years ago, I'm not going to sing for you, by Tim McGraw that doesn't really apply here except for the title. And the title of the song is Angry All the Time. It's one of my favorite songs. And it kind of stuck in my head that we're kind of this way. Now, maybe you're not, and maybe us individually aren't always, but as a group, as a society, it seems like we're constantly dealing with feeling wronged and feeling like somebody has taken advantage of us, and that somehow, we're being mistreated or cheated or whatever it might be, and it really, really does kind of, I think, show itself on every single aspect of life, whether it might be work, whether it might be relationships with our neighbors, at church. Every possible thing seems to be kind of a ground where we really kind of sometimes say, why is this happening to me? Why am I getting the short end of the stick? Why am I being laid off? Why didn't I not get that promotion? Why did, when they came out with the Big Ten schedule yesterday, Nebraska have the toughest one by far? Martin, why is that? Because we led the charge to get football played, so we're getting paid back. That's how we think about it. We think that somebody's out to get us. In fact, when I clicked on the Husker board yesterday, I knew it. There would be a thread that said, "I called it. We're being punished." And so there's this collective thought about if you do something that nobody else likes, maybe you're going to get put on the carpet for that. Anyway, I want to talk a little bit about Joseph this morning. And this story about Joseph really could be a series. I mean, everything from stories about how to raise your kids to how to be a good brother. But the one we're going to look at today is really about Joseph and some examples from his life, some lessons from his life about how he dealt with particular situations that were, in many cases, not of his making, and in many cases, designed to not really give him a break, not to give him any kind of a good leg up right now. Oftentimes we think of Joseph as a kid's story, and sometimes we do that a lot with stories from the Old Testament. We consign them to Sunday school. That make a good story right there. Let's make a coat, make it many colors, and we kind of leave it at that. And yet there's so many things in there that really speak to us today. If we go back and just recall a little bit about him, we remember that he was the favored son. He was, his father obviously loved him, and to the point where his brothers totally saw that he was out in front of them. And I guess we could do a lesson on having really a good sense of your surroundings when you're growing up, and things that you say, and buttons that would push other people's buttons. And if you wander out and tell your brothers, hey, by the way, I've had these dreams, and these dreams involve at some level you kind of worshiping me, that's not probably the way to really get in good with your brothers, who already have a bone to pick with you about how your father is kind of showing you to be the favor in that particular thing. But I read a quote that was a really, really good one from an author named Cherith Peters, and she said, he is one of the few characters in the Bible who, while he had sin in his life, who, when you look at most of the stories that deal with him, you really don't see him stained with a tremendous amount of sin. But you see him rising up in occasions to do what God would want him to do. And I really thought about that. I thought if you made a list of, who are the people who kind of live that kind of life, Joshua might have been one. There's not much about him being a person who somehow had a lot of problems in his life, but rose up and did the right thing. But Joseph really is someone who, when you look at his life, in every circumstance, he rises up and puts his faith in God. I want to ask a little bit of a question, and I don't know if there's a way to give an answer, and if you do, if you would yell it out, that would be great. But do we carry a list in our own minds, in our own hearts, of grievances against people that may go way back, may go back to childhood? I mean, if we're some of us in here are at least in our 60s. If we go back to our childhood and we still have a grudge against Mark Brown, who wronged me when I was in 3rd grade or 4th grade, then that's probably carrying that a little bit too long. But it's very probable that we do have some list of grievances that we carry with us, or grudges, or situations where we got the wrong end of the stick, or somebody treated us poorly, and it's just very, very difficult for us to let that go. And yet when we look at Joseph's life, his list, had he chosen to keep one, would have been very long. I mean, several different situations, and not just minor slights. Disgust for death, sold into slavery, lied to, his father being lied to about him. All these grievances he could have kept, and he chooses not to do that. So my first, I guess, point is, if you have that list, and if I have that list, and I'll be very frank, it's very difficult to at times let that list go. We need to let it go. It's a lesson we learned from Joseph, is that when we look at the things that we're going to look at today, he doesn't keep this list of wrongs and checks it off when he gets even with things. Lesson number 1 that we're going to look at this morning. When he gets sold into slavery, he does not appear to wallow in anger and self-pity, but he rises up and he places his faith in God. Okay, one of the things that when we get to heaven that I would love to ask are the unrecorded conversations that we don't ever get in the scriptures. What's Abraham thinking? What is he really thinking when he's taken Isaac to be sacrificed? It's not written in there. I'm sure his mind is just a jumble of different emotions about, why is God doing this? What's going to happen? And in this particular case, when we look at the life of Joseph, there's not large passages of verses that say Joseph was so mad at this and vowed someday to get revenge upon his brother. doesn't mention that at all. It's stated as a matter of fact that this is what he does. He had a perpetually, apparently, attitude that said, whatever circumstance I'm going to be put in, I'm going to rise up and honor and glorify God in everything that I do. He recognized how God had gifted him, and he worked hard in every situation to bring glory to God. Is that an easy thing to do when we get these wrongful situations in our life, to say, yeah, this isn't fair. I should have had a better opportunity there. I've been mistreated, but I'm going to use this situation not for bitterness and to wallow in that, but I'm going to find a way to bring glory to God out of that. Can you think of a good example where maybe someone you know has been in a situation where they really could have been bitter over being mistreated, being wronged, and they don't? The best one I could think of, I think Michael's given this story several times about a woman at their church when they lived in Virginia who had bad things happen to her, and instead of really wallowing in that and being overcome by that, instead led a very, very productive life and became better than that and really became very influential. Is that right? What's her name again? Yeah. And I think that's the kind of thing that we look at with that, is that when those things happen to us, how do we react to those? Okay, just take a quick trip back through the past week and think of a time when something did not go your way that should have, at least in our own mind. And how do we deal with that? I'm going to give you 10 seconds while I get a drink to think that through there for a minute. What do we learn from Joseph when he's sold into slavery by his brothers? Throw out some things that you would have thought if you were Joseph when that happened.
It's unfair. I didn't do anything to deserve this. I told the truth. I didn't lie about any of these dreams that made him mad. I didn't tell Dad to give me the coat, like me better. I'm just nicer to him.
Yeah, all those things. Unfair. Didn't do anything to deserve this. Hadn't really gone out of my way to curry extra favor with my dad. I just told them what my dreams were, and they're the ones who got angry about that. Yes?
Something like this happened. Joseph probably grew up under the government.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Dennis makes a good point. This didn't happen overnight. This was a growing situation between Joseph and his brothers that ends up being very detrimental to Joseph. But it wasn't something that just one day they all woke up and said, let's figure out a way that we can do him dirty, and nor did they go into the fields with that plan. I mean, he's the victim. He is the victim of a moment where he comes in and catches them, where they can get away with something, they can do him dirty with this, and they do. Anything else in this situation? Scott?
I was reading in John 3 yesterday, and there was John the Baptist was talking about, how he has to decrease while Jesus increases. And he said, and I liked his attitude, John 3:17 said, or 27, says, a man can receive only what is given him from heaven. In other words, what God gives us all situations, we just have to deal with what we've got, whatever that might be.
Scott just said that, if you didn't hear that over there, that a man can only deal with what we've been given from heaven. And so the ability to take those situations and deal with them are really, really pretty critical. And if we look at our own lives and say, I wasn't given the greatest amount of handsomeness. I wasn't given the greatest amount of athletic talent. I wasn't given the ability to do this or do that or whatever it might be. The list we could have is long of where we've been stopped, maybe by the world, by situations, by circumstances that weren't even necessarily of our own doing. And yet, how we rebound from that oftentimes is the measure of this. When Joseph gets sold into slavery, he has every right to say, in the eyes of the world, this is so bad. This is so wrong. I didn't do anything for this. And look, I mean, at home, I've got everything I could possibly need. I was just sent out to check on my brothers by my dad, and look what happens to me. So at that particular point in time, Joseph kind of has a decision to make. I knew I'd bring up tennis at least once, but we always talk about our tournaments. The biggest match of the day for us, for me as a coach, is one right after our kids have lost and they have to play again. How do they react in that next match? Because we're going to lose in matches. Everybody loses in a tournament for the most part. But if you sit there and you say, I'm never going to get that match back, and you can't bring yourself to move forward, then you really don't have the kind of fortitude that we need to have really good players. So what do you do when something lousy gets in your path and you can't go forward? That's my biggest test for my players is how do they come back? But Joseph's at that spot right there. And when Joseph gets this incredibly unfair situation, he gets sold, not once, but he gets sold to a man named Potiphar, who then puts him in charge of his house. And everything looks like it's on the upswing. Everything looks like it's going to be really, really good. And by the way, lesson number 2 is called Unwavering Integrity. So, by the way, there's no quiz at the end of this at the end, but unwavering integrity. And Joseph gets this great new life. It looks like everything is going to be wonderful for him. And he's in so good stead with Potiphar that Potiphar basically says, hey, you're in charge of my house. Everything I have is yours. And everything looks really great. But something happens. I'm going to read for you in Genesis 39, verses 6 through 12. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had, with Joseph in charge. He did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. But he refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. So even at this point right here, he has proven that with all these good things in his life and apparently the relative easy accessibility to one more really good thing that she's offering right there, at least in that particular framework, he has a choice. You could probably say, look at all the bad things that have happened to me so far. Look at the rough times I've been through. I deserve this. Life has been terrible to me over the last few years. But he doesn't. He chooses the path of integrity and tells her, I have had nothing withheld from me except you, and I'm not going to do this thing. He's proven himself to be worthy. He's probate dignum. That's for Scott and Karen and me there. But look what happens. One day he went to the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hand, and ran out of the house. Okay. So again, given a second opportunity to do this, he flees, he runs away. But ultimately, she tells on him, and he gets thrown, as you remember, into prison. He didn't do anything wrong. This is twice now. He hasn't done anything wrong, and yet he's been punished for these particular situations, and unfairly. So now, I don't know what the most unfair treatment you've ever had in your life is. I'm pretty sure none of us have been sold into slavery. None of us have probably ever had this situation where we were imprisoned for a false accusation about infidelity with another man's wife. So these are two incredibly major issues. So he ends up going to prison. Lesson number 3, he is not consumed by bitterness. When my boys were growing up, and I guess Megan too for that matter, I never let them mow the lawn. And you might think, well, that's kind of an oddball thing. And there's a little bit of an oddball story to that. First time Zach ever mowed the lawn was at his grandparents' house, and he went exactly 6 feet before he ran over an extended iron pipe that was coming out of the ground that he didn't see and bent the blade and ruined the motor. That may be why I didn't ever let him mow. But the real reason I didn't let him mow is because I liked the time where I was mowing and I was thinking. And I could think about things that I wanted to say, problems that I wanted to address, situations I wanted to resolve. But I'll be honest, there were times when in my own mind, I consumed, what's the word I'm looking for? I wrote, I guess that'd be good enough. I wrote mental letters of vindictiveness or revenge to people who had wronged me. I would use that time to say, this is what I would really say if I had the opportunity. And none of that was good. None of that made me better. And it was obvious that there, at least in some areas, I was being consumed by this idea of bitterness about this, that, and the other. And it was never really good. But yet in this particular situation, Joseph, who has been wronged, is in prison. And he's not, he's not sulking in his corner. He's doing what he does. He's been given positions of authority within prison. It's kind of interesting to note that in these last 2 situations, Joseph, who could have just said, I give up. What is the problem with God? I've done what he's wanted me to do. I've led a good life. And he keeps putting me in these situations where I'm getting shafted, where everything is bad in my life. And yet he doesn't do that. He instead puts himself in a position where people can use him for good. I want you to look in Ephesians, if you would, Ephesians 4:31 and 32. Now let me ask you this as we get ready to read this verse. Why do we let bitter feelings dominate our mindset? And if you have an answer to how to get rid of that, this would be a good time to share it. Do we have that? Do we have that struggle where bitter feelings really kind of roost around in there, and we don't really work hard to get rid of them? Yeah, it's easier than forgiveness. And it allows us to maybe feel a little bit superior. Say, look, I've been wronged here. I'm going to hold on to this for a while. I'm not going to let this one go. Richard?
I think we're used to fairness. Like these stories really anger us as Americans because we're used to things being fair. People in other cultures aren't really used to fairness. They're used to poverty and I have to be. In fact, when I pick a jury on entry cases, I don't really like people that have people think you want people that have really rough lives to self-sympathize. I really like people that have pretty good lives and understand fairness.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, this isn't fair.
Yeah.
You look, stuff like Aaron Abbott said, they got the concept of fairness. They just the concept of that flow. But we're used to things working out being fair. And the big things we have are unfairness are when, you punch the kid and then he hit you first and you hit second, and you think that's hugely unfair, and that's compared to poverty, death.
That punch the kid story is actually when I went back to the Mark Brown reference earlier, when I was in 3rd or 4th grade, York, Nebraska. We were getting in line to go home for lunch. We still left campus to go home, and I got in line, and this kid named Mark Brown jumped ahead of me, and I pushed him. He's bigger than me. I pushed him to get my place back, and of course the teacher saw me, and she said, to the end of the line. And I said, but I didn't do anything. He took my spot. And this is, by the way, is how times have changed. I immediately got slapped. By the way, there was a streak of 4 years in a row where I got slapped by a teacher. So this was just keeping the streak alive. And I went home, and I did cry. I cried pretty much all the way home because it wasn't fair. I mean, I had not done anything wrong. I just tried to, well, I didn't think. I just tried to get my spot back. And then when I talked to her, I wasn't really yelling at her. I was just explaining the situation, maybe in a little bit of a heated way. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I remember that. I mean, that was unfair to me. Scott, you're going to say something?
Yeah, it's like, it's all about me. You know, the thing is, when you don't want to let go of something, it's like a lack of humility.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about me. I'm the most important one. I've been wrong, so it's okay for people to come.
Yeah, the concept of I'm at the center of this. The world, in one respect, at least, revolves around me in this particular area, and dealing with that is at times kind of difficult. This is another crossroads moment when Joseph goes to prison about what he's going to do next. And we see that, again, he chooses to put himself in the position of being useful to God. Let me read this, Ephesians 4:31 and 32. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. That doesn't sound like a mindset that says, I'm going to hold on to this for a long time. I'm going to keep this there and go ahead and use this at some point in time at all. So he moves on from this. He recognizes that, and we'll see, I think, that for God actually has a plan here. A lot of times we don't see that particular plan. Gary, do you have a comment? Gary said sometimes you have to walk away from situations like that, of the bitterness and being consumed by that. That's exactly right. I think in the middle of all this, Joseph must have realized that God can use me in this situation. I had a most interesting discussion Thursday at one of our tennis tournaments. There's a guy who I'm friends with. I met him at a basketball game a year ago. He's from Winfield. His name on Facebook is Matthew Two Stumps. And the reason his last name is Two Stumps, it's really not his last name, is because he had both of his legs amputated. And at the ball game, we really didn't have a chance to really talk about how that had happened. And I'd seen him one other time in between then. Didn't have that opportunity, but he was there Thursday watching his daughter play. And so I'm sitting there right next to him, and I thought to myself, this is just too obvious a situation. I mean, we've become kind of friends, and I've never asked him how this happened or why this happened or whatever. And so I waded in and I said, Matthew, tell me your story. And he goes, happy to. I mean, he was ready to tell his story. And his story basically was about, he said, I know this is going to sound weirder than anything you've ever heard. I am a much better man with no legs than I was with two. He said, I was a terrible dad. I was a terrible husband. I lived an awful life. I did not have this happen to me on purpose, but when it did, one of the things that adjusted in my life was I realized of all the things I had done poorly. And it was really a pretty amazing thing. And he says, I go to schools now and talk about making good decisions in life and making sure that the life that you live is a productive life and one that blesses other people. I mean, he is a spiritual man. I don't know if we're spiritual exactly the same, but his message was that he's used his situation to be able to reflect for God what has happened in his life. And I thought to myself, that's pretty amazing. I mean, that's pretty. I would hope I would be able to do that without having to lose my legs. But in his particular case, he felt like it was necessary for that to happen. In this particular case right here, Joseph puts himself is put in a situation where he can be good for God or not good for God, and he chooses to be good for God. Okay, lesson number 4, his ability to forgive his brothers without any apparent hostility and bitterness. Okay, think of the worst thing that somebody, I mean, we can kind of forgive the person we really don't know. Maybe we can forgive them a little bit for bad things they've done to us. But if you've been done wrong within your family. And Scott, I'm giving you open forum right here. And you can't let it go, or it's just there. That to me would take maybe a little bit extra level of forgiveness, something that you would say, how could they have possibly done that to me? How could they have possibly treated me in that particular way? And how could he not have held a grudge against his brothers? When the brothers come to Canaan, when the brothers come to Egypt to get food for the famine that has ravaged Canaan, both sets of the parties here have no idea of what was about to happen. In the chapter before, in chapter 41, Joseph has children, and he names them. Anybody remember what their names were? Ephraim and Manasseh. Okay, I don't know if you've ever taken note of what their names mean. Let me find it here. Oh, I can't even find it. Somebody look it up for me and tell me what it means real quick. He names his boys names that are kind of indicators that he is grown past these things. So when he's in charge of all of Egypt, except just under the Pharaoh, because of his ability to tell the dreams that come true about the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine, he's an enormous amount of power. Anything he wants to do will be done. And yet he appears to have turned his back on any kind of bitterness toward his brothers. Doesn't even look like he really thinks about them. Like that world has gone away. And then all of a sudden, here they are. They show up. And they don't know what's going to happen. He didn't know it was going to happen. And yet he's got the upper hand because they don't recognize him. Anybody find the name? Yeah. Okay. Manasseh. Manasseh. What now? Okay, so both these situations are really kind of indicators of I'm not harboring any kind of ill will toward the people that are back in my old life. He's moved on. He's doing better. And here they come up. And let's discuss this for a minute because I'm a tiny bit conflicted. You know, the situation that happens when he sees them, he does several different things with them in which he never reveals himself to them at first, doesn't tell them who he is. And I guess you might, in one respect, kind of say he's playing with them. I mean, he does. He doesn't reveal his identity at first, and he makes them go back and get Benjamin. And all these things are his secret. They don't know him. Do you think he mistreated them there? If you remember back to the story. Or do you think he was just trying in his own way to figure out, how am I going to deal with this effectively? How am I going to make this situation work out? I think it was that. I mean, I think he wanted so desperately to see the rest of his family that he needed to find a way to make that happen. Why is he ultimately able to forgive them? Look how his life has changed. Look what he's been cheated of. He was sold into slavery. The only thing that was in their favor was the fact that they did not kill him initially. That's the only thing that was in their favor. They sold him into slavery. They lied to their dad. They probably at some point in time kind of were consumed by guilt. About the only one who really looks like he comes out of this smelling a little bit better is Reuben, who argued with them about why they did it. Why did you do this? And yet here's a situation where Joseph has every bit of power to exact any kind of revenge on them that he wants. And he doesn't. He doesn't do it. Ultimately, he basically says, what? Why does he not do this? Why does he not get revenge on them? God intended it for good. Now, this is great in a biblical story. And we can look at this and say, man, what a great moral, what a great lesson. God intended this for good. When it's 4,000 years ago, and it involves Joseph and not us. When it's us in these situations, to me, it isn't as easy as looking at this particular story and saying this. I'm not always inclined, and maybe neither are you, to look for how God is using this situation I've been put in for His glory. All I'm thinking of, as Scott mentioned earlier, the fact that it's a me world. How am I affected by this? If you remember back toward the end of Field of Dreams, I don't know how many of you remember that movie, one of my favorites, when Kevin Costner says, what's in it for me? You know, that's one of my favorite moments in what I think is an epic movie. But it really does kind of describe how we kind of roll with things. What is in it for me? Without saying, how is what I'm going to do right here going to bring ultimate glory to God by the way that I'm handling this situation, by the way that I'm living my life? And I read another line that was really good by a guy named Peter Tindry that said, Joseph understood that while people do terrible things, there is nothing that catches God by surprise. Now think about that for a minute. Nothing catches God by surprise. He knows what's going to happen. And if we allow ourselves to be put in God's hands that particular way, there's a stronger chance that the bitterness and bad feelings we have about situations and people will go away better. You know, I think maybe there's reasons why people enter our lives that test us, that give us reason to say, I've got to get a little bit better strategy here. You know, I can't always deal, with people who bring me nothing but sunshine and lollipops. I may have to deal with people who bring me thorns, or who get under my skin, or who somehow manage to raise the hair on the back of my neck. Those people give me opportunities to be used by God as well. All right, the fifth lesson. And I like this because I think it's probably hard for me and maybe all the rest of us as well. And that is that Joseph was willing to wait on God. He was willing to wait on God for his time. Probably a decade or longer in slavery, in prison, for something he didn't do. We read a lot of stories, and we hear a lot of stories about people who are wrongly imprisoned. It seems to be more and more all the time these days about people who are in prison for crimes they did not commit. And it's one thing maybe to be in prison for something you knew you did, maybe in a bad moment or whatever, but to be in prison for something that you didn't do, the ability to kind of at that point in time really be forgiving of people, be forgiving of situations, has to be very, very difficult. And yet, while he's there, he doesn't push the timetable. He just waits and waits and waits. And in my mind, if we're honest about what we might have known about Joseph, if God would have never come through to let him out and to be in this situation, he still would have been fine with being in God's will, being allowed to do what God wants him to do. Faith allowed God to come through for him. Joseph's faith, when you look back at every single situation that he's put in, his faith in God carries him through to the next situation, and ultimately carries him through to a successful ending of a relationship with his father, his brothers, and his own personal life. He worked hard, he did his best, and he trusted God in everything that we did. Okay, now, real quickly, how do we emulate this life? What are the things that we can do that Joseph did that made Joseph Joseph? He's got these brothers who weren't like him. You may have brothers and sisters who aren't like you. We may have brothers and sisters here who aren't like us. How do we become the Joseph mindset that he was able to do through these scriptures? What is it that he had? And if you can think of some specifics, do that we can do as well. Okay, now how do we get to the point where we trust God unconditionally? Okay, that's a good point and a good answer. I mean, we see what the end result was. He was willing to trust God in every situation. Getting there is probably a huge amount of trial and error, small victories, at times having to say, Let's let it happen, and then seeing where the growth comes from. Very good. What else, Dave?
For me, it's been knowing exactly who I am in the eyes of God.
Okay.
So I think Joseph knew exactly who he was, and that gives him confidence knowing that this too will pass and God will bring you through.
Okay. Knowing who we are in the eyes of God. I think there's got to be a degree of humility in that. I mean, to think of the times in his life that Joseph was humbled, sold into slavery, sold, wrongly imprisoned. That these aren't minor situations, and yet he's put in a humbling situation, even when he didn't deserve to be humbled. Now, there are times we totally deserve to be humbled, but this doesn't appear to be a situation where he was asking to be humbled, and yet he lived a humbled life. He did exactly what he was supposed to. So that's good. What else? Yeah. Each day was a new beginning. That's exactly right. When we get up every morning, we're going to find that we have a whole new set of challenges. We have a whole new set of circumstances to work for. We have a whole new opportunity for God's victories coming through us if we allow us to be those people. And the interesting thing is, I don't think we have to look all that hard to find the opportunities to be able to be active in people's lives. They're all over the place. Dwayne, that was a good one. What else? Anything else? I think if we were able to see in every one of these situations that Joseph found himself in, he never distanced himself from God. He was probably in prayer all the time, probably talked to God outwardly. He lived a life that was devoted to God. So he had at his core doing what God wanted him to do in every single thing. And if we approach our daily lives like that everything we do is centered around being answerable to God for our actions, showing the faith in his ability to deliver us, showing the faith in his ability to guide us into situations where we can reflect his glory, and to have the kind of attitudes that are absent of bitterness and malice and full of love and encouragement for everybody we come in contact with. We can be a Joseph. We can have that kind of mindset. We may not get the ultimate stage that Joseph ended up getting, described as the second most powerful man in the world at that time. God may not give us that platform, but he may give us a platform that's equally important in his eyes for the area that we live. Thank you for your comments, and we're done.